Hi, I'm Paul Marcel. So I'm getting back to my Angle Madness project. I put it on kind of a hiatus for 7 to 8 months there because I wanted to make the Tim Burton table that you see hiding back there, and also holidays and honestly me wrapping my head around the design for the rest of the parts, because the rest of the build is a lot more complicated than just making these cuts. So at least I had to sort of sit and think and doodle a lot on this paper here earlier this week to get that resolved. Now, I will say I'm disappointed that in my last episode I was rabbeting all these tops. Well, it turns out that when I did a dry run and I put all this stuff together, I realized that there's probably about 6 or 7 of those edges I didn't do. What I did is I dry assembled the tops of this. This is the second unit, actually. The first unit hasn't had any rabbets done yet, because what I want to do is when I get through building this, I'll be able to find, I might be able to fine tune some of the way that I do things. I might find that if I do this one step before this other step, it's a lot easier. Well, this way here, I'll be able to take advantage of all that hindsight when I do the other unit. So I did this dry assembly with all the dominoes, put it all together. So then I grabbed the wheel gauge and I used it to verify that all the rabbets were the same all the way across. I mean, you can see where there's steps and such. As long as they're pretty darn close together, that's all I care about, because when I do the glue up, I'll be using some thickened epoxy. It'll take care of any of the little tiny minor gap there in a structural way, so it'll be very, very strong. Plus, I'm planning on adding some reinforcing triangles underneath it. Now, one of the complications with this design is that I really don't have a lot of room on the underside. In a way, what the bottom is here is it's just one of the panels that I made. So that panel doesn't give me a lot of room to hide kind of the mechanics of a drawer. So that was one of the complications that I had. Now, I had some ideas, and I sort of said, well, I'll be able to come up with a solution when I was first doing my design, which meant I was postponing thinking about it till later. But what I did come up with is a pretty nice design for the way the drawer runners are going to go, and we're going to see that later as we go through the build. But I needed to work all that out first before I got too carried away with gluing in the panels. So what we're going to do in this episode is basically get these boxes glued up with just the bottom panel. I need the bottom panel on so that it's going to help hold this whole box together, so that I can then build the drawer webbing on the inside, and then we're going to top it with the top panel. Now, if this was a normal drawer box where it was all square, we would have the advantage that we could build the drawer assembly and we could, drop it in from the top, or if we already put the top panel in, we could raise it up from the bottom. It'd be really easy. With this shape, however, the drawer webbing itself is going to take the same shape, so it's a bit like a cork. I have no choice but to come in from the top unless I can build the webbing on the inside of the box. And even there, you have some limitations because of the angled sides. Now, some of the things that we have to take into account when I'm putting this thing together is that this is a drawer front. But before I can glue this whole thing up, of course, I need to cut that out, since it's only going to go up to here on both sides. So that's not a complication. It's just something to remember before you go and glue it up 7 months after you thought of all this the first time. Now, the backs, they're going to get split at the time of the glue up. I kept them as a single piece because it made it a little bit easier to do the work on it as a larger piece. So I need to make sure I have enough room there for me to get to reach in there and put wires inside the column, because that's what the whole point of the column is for. So when you're doing a project called Angle Madness, these are the goofy glue ups that you get, with all the clamps going all different directions and different little accessory pieces on here to be able to get the clamps to put the force down through the joint. So now when I did one of the joints, I did record it. So let's take a look and see how that goes, and you'll be able to see how these miter stitches work. And then we're going to talk about how I can do it without the miter stitches. So first with the miter stitches. So I disassembled this one joint so that we can take a look at how this clamp up went. Now you can see from looking at this joint, there's no way I could put a clamp here, right? It's just going to skate right off this angled surface. So I need to get myself a flat surface. Now the miter stitches from Bridge City, they have 2 sides on them. One of them is a 45-degree angle and the other one's a 22.5. So if you're doing a joint across 90 degrees, you use half that, 45 side. If you're doing a 45 like this projection is basically 45, then you're going to use the 22.5. So I have the 22.5 sides showing here, And then the miter stitch itself is simply, clamped to the wood so that it doesn't move. That's why we've got a little PSA sandpaper on the bottom. And then I can put the clamp so that it's actually not touching this wood. It's indirectly doing it by grabbing the miter stitch flat surface and pulling it into this, flat edge that's on the other side of this board. Now, if you're doing an angled joint where you actually, like this one here, where both surfaces are angled, well, then you'd put some miter stitches on both sides of the joint so that you'd get two flat surfaces you could pull together. So what if you don't have any miter stitches? I mean, miter stitches were made by Bridge City back in 92 or something? So without scoring some on eBay, how are you going to possibly do a joint like this? Well, it turns out it's not really that difficult to do. We can use the same ideas that you have with the miter stitch and carry them over to just using, some simple scrap. Like here are some offcuts from some of the panels that I made for this. We're going to go ahead and use this on the next joints. So this is the bottom tier, and one of the problems with the bottom tier is that some of the facets, they're pretty small. So it makes it a little bit more difficult to get some of these miter stitches on here, which are considerably larger, especially when I end up needing the miter stitch, the head of it where the clamp is going to grab, to be considerably further away. In a way, I would have to clamp this head here pretty much there. Well, there's nothing to clamp on. You can see I almost dropped it. So how are we going to solve this problem? Well, I'm not going to clamp this piece here to this piece here yet. I'm not on that part of the glue up. But what I want to do is I want to do the back to it. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to use a piece of ply. This is a scrap piece of ply that I used from my panels, and I'm going to place it down here strategically so that this one can act as a clamp head. What needs to happen with this, when the clamp head engages on it, it's pushing the force straight up through the middle of this joint. And all we're trying to do is get a little ledge for that clamp to grip and grab onto. So what I want to do is I want to place this down here on this bottom surface. I'm going to place it a certain distance away from this edge. I'm going to place it parallel to that edge. And that distance away from it is such that this far side of it, if I were to grip through it and pull straight up through it, it's going to go right through that joint. So let me go ahead and place it. So like that, I've stretched it across. It's given me a surface to grab onto. So let me put this back piece back on. We can see how this is going to work when it's in use. I can hook on onto this bottom piece of ply and clamp that into place. So we can see how this is a simple solution to the problem. Now there is one thing I want to point out when you're doing these glue ups, is that a lot of these joints, they're all these beveled, angled cuts. This is all end grain on here, and you're gluing it up to something else that's all end grain. So when you glue this whole thing together, that's the structure right there. Sure, the panel is going to add a lot of strength to it, but you really want this joint to be strong. So when I did a previous glue up on video, I took a picture of it when I had just slathered a ton of glue on one of the joints. All I did is from then I slathered glue on the other side of the joint, and then when I came back, I held it up to the camera. And you can see the difference in how much glue had absorbed in those basically 10 seconds. So the lower drawer assembly all glued up. Now I can plan the cut for the panel to insert it into the bottom. Now, a couple things I did as preparation ahead of time for this is the curly maple is on the bottom side of this panel, because that's, when we put this box on the top and we trace where to cut, that's the correct orientation. There's no way that this is a mirror image where I could flip it. But the thing is where the veneer is located on the top here on this inside surface isn't necessarily where it is on the other side. So what I did is I took the combination square, found where the veneer was on this side, and I transferred it to the top. So I have two lines here showing me where basically the outside edge of the underlying veneer is located. So this way here, when I cut it, I won't find a little sliver of plywood that's going to be exposed. There was still a slight lift to this far corner, so by clamping it down, I'm keeping it flat. This table was designed to be flat, so I also did verify that using some winding sticks. So, sticking the winding sticks here and sighting, I was able to verify there's no twist. And then just looking at it this way here, I can see that I don't have any dips that I'm pulling in by doing the clamping. Now the box, I reinserted the drawer into the front, so all this has been glued together, but I just inserted the drawer part there so we have something here to help kind of build the mass of the whole box. And also in the back, I just put a piece of MDF and two clamps to basically span the gap. Now how I sized this, I basically just used a rod, extended rod, to act as a storyboard between the two sides. So by stretching it across here, I just made sure that this distance was the same distance that I have up in the front. So now I know that these two sides are parallel, at least inside the rabbet. So now at this point, all we have to do is place this box in between the lines that I drew on there to make sure that we have veneer. There, I'm liking the positioning of that. Now the trick is to remember, leave the line when we're doing the cuts. So to get this panel cut to size, I'm going to use the track saw. It makes it a whole lot easier than dealing with like a table saw trying to get this lined up straight. Because in this case, all we do, take the track and just drop it right on the line. Now in this case here, I want to keep the line, so I'm going to want to make sure the line is exactly underneath the edge of that splinter guard, and then make the cut, and the blade will be on the outside. So now I'm going to go ahead and use the guide rail that's on the MFT because it'll be clamping it for me and it makes it a lot easier on camera. So I'm going to want to move the line underneath the splinter guard. But another way to do it, if you like, is to give yourself a different line to line up to. So what we can do is, I have this line already here. That line we have to keep. I can put a straight edge on here and then grab like a red Sharpie, a fine point Sharpie, and I can put this right next to the line that's already there. So this is the line that we want to keep. Because it's right next to the line, it's really easy for me to get this straight edge exactly where I want it. And now, when I'm drawing the line using the Sharpie, don't press up all the way up against the edge. Keep it a little bit vertical so that the line is a little bit offset, and it'll be just to the outside of the line that we see here. So with this, I can now basically keep the red outside the splinter guard. It's a little easier to see if the edge of the splinter guard and the line aren't parallel, well then the cut underneath isn't parallel either. So it gives you a little bit of other clues if you like to use that. So I'll do it this way for this particular cut. Now we can put the saw on here. Now I don't need this off-cut splinter guard on here, so we can actually remove that. And I'll put a plug for my blog. You can find a blog article that describes making this longer version of it. It's so easy to do with just some scrap wood that you got out of the bin and a couple number 6 screws. What the benefit of this is that even on a shallow plunge, this is engaged with the saw. So with the panel cut to size, I popped it into this underside of the second tier so I could get a look and see how it came out. And it really came out good when you're squeezing it into the corners. Everything is matching up really nicely, so I'm happy with that. There's still more work to be done though on this panel before we go and do the actual glue up. So one thing that we're going to have to verify is, while it's still dry, is to press this down and make sure that there's a ridge all the way around. Because what we're going to do is, after this has been glued into place, we're going to take a router and we're going to flush this. So we need to have material here to remove. If this was at all below the edge, you'd risk being able to see some of the ply material here or the edge of the veneer. It would look terrible. You couldn't sand that out. Now this is the panel from the bottom tier, and what I've done here is I've cut out some notches. If I line it up in the same orientation as this panel, you can see that I've cut this big notch away where the drawer front would go. Now if you remember, the drawer fronts are, they have their own rabbet down here that's going to be shaped a little bit more, but that's acting as the drawer pull. So you're going to reach underneath and pull it out. It's not going to hang below the box or anything like that. That's all kind of integral into the box. But the problem with that is, typically you would cover this exposed plywood with edge banding or just basically veneer that you glue onto the edge and then trim. The problem with that is, because of the way the drawer is, I'm going to be reaching in here and you're going to be pulling against it. So you're going to be rubbing your finger against that edge of the veneer. Over time it's going to start to lift, it's going to crack. So I don't want that. I want to avoid having any just simple edge band veneer in here. So I've recessed this back for 2 reasons. One, it's going to give me more room for my fingers to get in, so it's a little bit more comfortable to actually be able to just get it right in there and pull the drawer. Second, with this extra room, I'm going to be able to now create a molding out of the excess curly maple that I have, and I'll be putting the molding in here. So it'll be a decorative effect, but also it'll be hardwood against there. So when you're pulling against it like that, it's not going to want to flake off or bend. I also notched out another piece back here, and this is just to allow more room for wires to travel up and down into the column. Now this one here, because there isn't going to be any traffic, it's not a visible show surface, I will be simply edge banding that one with some excess veneer. Now the problem is I cut this with the bandsaw. The bandsaw, while it can cut really, really nice and straight, the edge is not going to be like a jointed edge. So what I did is I kind of used a sandpaper jointing trick. I took a hardwood block and I put PSA sandpaper, 80 grit and 120 grit on both sides, and then was just sanding up against the surface. So with everything being flat and pressed down, this is now pretty much a jointed edge. Just got rid of the little ripples that come off of the bandsaw. So now this is going to provide a great glue surface for putting that molding on, and it won't have any gaps when we're done. Now you're going to want to elevate this on a piece of MDF or something else like that to get it up above the bench, because this corner down here isn't going to be a very good sanding surface, because you're probably going to leave a lip on the bottom. So now the last thing I did to this panel to prepare it for being glued in is I cut a chamfer around this edge. So I took the trim router and I put, in my case, a V-grooving bit in here, and then I used the edge guide because I don't have a chamfering bit with a bearing. And then you put a small chamfer along the inside edge. So this is the edge that's going to be inside the rabbet. So if I put this on here and you took a look from the side, you would see that there's a small recess where that corner is now. So I'm not trying to jam the corner into this corner. If there's any amount of crud in this corner, or if one of the edges here is not quite nice, it can prevent the glue up from happening well, because you're not going to be able to get the panels to squeeze in properly. By doing this, I'm eliminating that because the corners aren't going to be able to butt together, and it also happens to give a good place for glue relief. If you have a little bit too much, it'll be able to go through this corner, or if there happens to be some dry bits in the glue, they'll get kind of squeezed down and forced out. This is a place for them to go. So it's a really quick move to make when you're gluing a panel into a rabbet like this, and it tends to avoid problems when you already are going to have enough problems with the glue up. So probably not the most engaging episode when you're just doing panels and putting them in here, but there are enough little special items that needed to be done to these panels, partly because of the way this is an angled box and even just the clamping elements of this box, that hopefully there's some takeaway here that can be used in some of your projects. But when we're going to come back on the next episode, that's when we're going to be building the drawer assembly here on the inside. So things are going to look up.